everybody, and welcome to my latest and most creative, beautiful megabase tour. This megabase can consistently produce and consume 1,000 science packs per minute, with the science packs and production materials being delivered to their destination via cars, traveling along 3 circles made of belts, just like we see here. But before we dive into the intricacies of the circles themselves, let's take a broad look at the layout of the base. Here we are in map view with the base actually turned on. We're currently working towards worker robot speed 15 at the moment, and you'll see that the focal point of the base is really these 3 main circles. I'm currently standing in the bottommost circle, but this is where I have my supply depot or my make everything factory here in the middle, and then nuclear power plants here in the upper quadrants, as well as kind of spread throughout the base. And then in the bottom quadrants of the bottommost circle, I have everything needed for module production, which includes circuits, fluid processing, and then the actual module factory itself. The top left circle is solely for circuit production and includes 1 large factory for green circuits, 1 large factory for red circuits, and then 2 smaller factories in the upper quadrants for blue circuits here and here. The top right circle includes all of my science factories, flanking a large lab factory here in the middle. Surrounding the inner circles, we have a very large inner train network, and then to the very top of the circles, we have additional factories that are needed, including oil drop-off and oil processing over here. We have plastic production here, a coal drop-off point over here, and then we have production of rocket fuel, rocket control units, and then low-density structures in the middle portion here, as well as an artillery train parking lot over here. To the far left and right of the base, we have my smelting factories along with a parking lot. So up here to the very top left, we have my parking lot for iron ore trains coming in, as well as copper trains coming into this left stacker. And then below that is my iron plate production. Below that is copper plate production. And then back over to the right-hand side, we have steel production over here, along with a stone ore drop-off point and stone brick smelting area over here. To the very bottom is also what I call my mini base that includes smaller versions of my smelting factories, along with my Covarex enrichment area and nuclear fuel production area that helps to solely supply my bottommost circle, and that way the production for science is entirely separate from the production required to keep the base and modules running. Working our way inside out, we do have a defensive outer wall, and then even outside from that, we have my outermost train network, and this is kept separately from my inner train network because I only planned on having ore or oil fluid trains or my artillery trains traveling along the outermost train network. And from there, those branch out to the many mining outposts that I have. As far as militarization, I do have a factory for everything from combat bots to artillery shells to ammo to regular logistic and construction bots in this rectangle over here. And then I do have some defensive trains parked to pick up supplies and deliver them to the outposts or to my defensive walls via these train stops here and here. And I also have spawn here to the very right section of the base, which has a train parked here permanently to pick you up should you die and take you back anywhere throughout the base. And then if you haven't noticed it until this point, I also made room for some more aesthetic or beautiful pieces of art around the base. In the very center is something that I made that comprises the Soelless Gaming logo. We've also got a banner here in the middle that we'll see in just a minute. We've got some heat exchanging pipe artwork over here to the top left thanks to JD Plays, and then over here to the bottom right we've got an Atlas looking guy kind of holding up the base here. Back in first person view, we will take a closer look at all of these factories and the components of the base, starting with this bottommost circle where I am now. Now this is where you'd be coming after spawning into the map for the first time, because this is where you could literally run around as if you were shopping, going through all of these boxes here to pick up any items that you need for armor, like you can have here, to the components that go into your suit of armor, to anything you can think of for base building or factory production. Should you be in need of modules, you'd be coming over here to this factory that produces 12 per minute each of efficiency, productivity, and speed 3 modules. And you can tell when we have full storage because these boxes are wired up to these lights here. And when the lights are full in their color, that means we have full storage of each of those modules. To keep up with 12 modules per minute, all of the nearby factories in this bottommost circle were also designed and scaled down for their production rates to keep up with 12 modules per minute as well. Now the thing that makes this space so special and creative is definitely the cars on belts. You will notice cars traveling on the belts of the 3 circles carrying supplies en route to their destination that they pick up from various loading stations like this one here. As a result, this base lacks in a traditional main bus system but makes up for it in the density of their storage capacity. I owe the circuitry credit to Alazin, who has done a great video explaining cars on belts that you can see by clicking the icon up here to the top right corner. But I've taken his circuitry to help filter out cars to different areas of the base, like we can see here with this pathway section. How this works is that if a car has a certain item, which I call the filter, in its inventory, a filter inserter will pull from that car, which triggers the combinators and circuitry system to raise the nearby gate, which is right here. When the gate is raised, the car goes in a different direction, in this case upwards, and is given back the filter item. If the car does not have this special filter item, the gate remains down and continues on its way like you're seeing a lot of these cars doing. With this feature, I've been able to direct cars throughout many different pathways, including to supply my supply depot, like we just saw this car with a shotgun in its inventory do, as well as it can technically go to any of the 3 circles throughout the base, as well as take shortcuts throughout the base when needed. And I even included a safety feature nearby to sections where there's car merging from one circle to another, just like that car did there, because I have had experience where the cars can get jammed. So in this area of belt, if the box here becomes full with more than one filter item, in this case a piece of armor, a speaker will alarm loudly so I know to come over and manually fix the car jam before it gets too out of control. I've also included some belt reading on areas of pathway that intersect with the cars on belts, just like I have here, and that way the cars will always stop to give priority for the player passing through. You might have also noticed that to the left and right circles I have the cars color-coded to match with the items in their inventory. The orange cars stay on the left circle only and carry raw items that go into circuit production, so primarily they're going to be carrying things like plastic, copper, coal, and they're going to be the ones dropping off supplies, while the purple cars will actually end up transferring between left and right circles, and they end up carrying similar things like iron and copper, but primarily their purpose is to carry circuits like we can see here. They also have some different filter items, which is how the inserters know whether to let the car pass from one circle to another or stay in their current circle. The red cars that you see here are only supposed to be staying in the right-hand circle, and their purpose is to feed the rocket silo themselves, along with a couple other miscellaneous science factories with their items in their inventory, but they primarily carry things like rocket fuel, low-density structures, and rocket control units. Meanwhile, we also have a couple other miscellaneous colored cars around here. Green colored cars carry more raw materials but still stay in the right-hand circle instead of going on to the left. But the reason why I found it so important to actually go through the trouble of color coding my cars was because I do know from experience how they can be a little bit tricky to work with, and they can get jammed, and sometimes they can lose their filter, especially if there's a power outage and then there's an inserter just randomly continuing to pull from their car. So this way, with them being color-coded, I can actually keep track of their filter item more easily and just make sure that they're in the right circle or the right location that they should be in. You'll also notice there are multiple points throughout the base where there are zigzagging belts that cars travel to pick up supplies, just like we have here. These areas have trains drop off the supplies, then bots pull from the active provider boxes into the nearby requester boxes that feed into the cars. To make sure there's plenty of filling time, the belts in these areas are yellow, but in some parts I've even added in areas of circuitry to pause the belts to allow more time for filling. The robo coverage in these areas are isolated to keep bots all within their own private logistic network and improve their efficiency. Now we can see circuit production in action to the left circle of the base. These builds have up to 12 beacons surrounding each assembler, just like you can see here, and keep up with the production rate to support 1,000 science per minute. To supply these factories, filter inserters pull from the paused cars that travel nearby. To get these inserters to work with cars from these angles properly, they actually have to be more than one tile away from the car. So normally, if we were just having these go directly into the belts or an assembler, this inserter would be closer to the belt line. But if we were to have that happen for the inserters that are actually delivering the item into the car, all of the items would end up on the belt, which is not what we want with a design like this. Also, they still have to be one tile away even when pulling from the cars like you can see here, because otherwise it would be reading the inventory of the belt instead of the inventory of the car. The blue circuit factories are unique because they use direct insertion starting from the base materials into the next tier of materials to keep up with production. So that way I never have to worry about siphoning off from the main green and red circuit factories to supply the blue circuits, which is really nice. I even have plastic and acid getting produced on site, which starts with crude oil getting fed from the top. They go into these refineries here, which only do basic oil processing, which I did intend on purpose because I wanted to avoid using up my already very compact space for things like extra cracking or additional chemical plants. And I also don't have to worry about fluid balancing this way. So this way, only petroleum is produced, and that gets fed into the plastic chemical plants over here, as well as the sulfur chemical plant over here, which then ends up putting the sulfur into a car, which I use for storage, and that way I can use as direct insertion as possible for the acid production. From the circuit circle is another car filter junction where the circuit cars move on to the right circle, which you can see this car doing. And this actually passes the military zone where I have all sorts of ammo getting produced. Cars also pause here along the way, but this is one of the rare instances where for the military area that I do have primary use of requester boxes that the bots then deliver items to. So that's why you see them running around here getting items delivered. But then the cars continue along the way, making slower pauses when able to also fill up on other miscellaneous items like copper and iron plate that they might not have already gotten full with. And then they stop to deliver circuits here that then get fed into the Speed 1 module factory up above here. And then in case you missed it, we did pass by the banner that I talked about earlier that says, "Welcome to Poober's server." And this is all credit to Deuces who customized this specifically for me, so I really do appreciate it, but I think it provides a really good and colorful bit of artwork to the base. Following the purple circuit car from left to right, it finally does enter the science circle, which is the circle to the far right. And this circle definitely has the most amount of factories in it and the most amount of dense pauses along the way, which means that the cars technically have the longest time in this circle's rotation. But it does travel from clockwise around this way, starting with delivering items into the satellite, and then we also have a bunch of very compact, almost spaghetti-like chemical plants up here that are supplying things into plastic, as well as batteries, as well as things to make sulfuric acid up here, as well as the first science factory is going to be yellow science in this area over here. And then the upper right quadrant of this circle is only for the purpose of supplying purple science. And then we have blue science just below that, sharing the quadrant with military science. And then red science over here to the left lower quadrant, followed by the 2 rocket silos, and then green science over here just above the rocket silos. Now for the purple cars, they actually will take this junction here and continue on from right to left back into the left circle to resupply with circuits, but all of the other cars continue along this rotation and filling up through these zigzagging resupply stations along the way, with multiple ones up here to the top, right, and bottom. I won't go into too much detail to bore you guys about the design of these science factories, since there's an entirely separate video if you guys want more detail about that you can click on right up here. But what I will say is that these were all designed with the purpose in mind of supplying 1,000 science of their respective science per minute. And then those individual sciences get fed into 4 corners of this lab factory. Now this lab factory, I actually owe credit to Leon's skills. And most of the time, I actually try to do my own builds for everything, but when I saw this design on Reddit, I could not help myself. I knew that I had to build it, so I did. So entire credit goes to him. It's just a beautiful, symmetrical design, and technically it can support up to 1,500 science per minute. So you'll notice that if you are starting up science for the first time after a decent amount of time, or if you have a decent amount of buffer of science, that it actually will run at 1,500 per minute for the first couple of minutes or so, and then eventually taper off because science is capped at 1,000 science per minute production rate. But it certainly is beautiful. It's almost like a piece of art in itself, and I'm very happy this is kind of like the centerpiece in my right circle here. The most difficult aspect of this science factory design was actually figuring out how to make sure that I had enough supply of materials coming in constantly to feed my science factories, because of course there's not always the same car coming at any given time, and not every car has the same type of materials in its inventory. So to combat that, I made sure that I had a decently sized buffer on all of my boxes. And that way, if there's a little bit of a delay in getting one car for delivering the materials, I have a decent amount in storage to last until the next car shipment comes in. Speaking of science and production rates, I am very proud to say that after hours and hours of troubleshooting, not only was I able to design a build that does 1,000 science per minute for all of the sciences, including military science, but I actually have the production rates to prove it. So let's take a look here. We're currently in the 5-second interval, but here is the 1-minute interval. Here is the 10-minute interval. And then here is the hour interval. After all of this hard work, I have researched through Mining Productivity 50. I am currently working on and so close to finishing Worker Robot Speed 15, and then I've currently launched 5,045 rockets. The 3 factories that make up the rocket parts are all fairly straightforward. I do have rocket fuel getting produced over here to the left, rocket control units here in the middle, and then low density structures over here to the right. And they all have 12 beacons around any given assembler, and all of the materials are supplied from fairly nearby sources. So in the case of the low density structures, they get fed the materials from the right train drop-off point over here. The rocket control units get fed the Speed 1 modules as well as the blue circuits from the factory here, and the blue circuits are fed from right to left, joining up with the Speed 1 module belts, and then get fed upwards. Meanwhile, the rocket fuel has a different scenario where I actually have crude oil getting dropped off with advanced oil processing done on site. And I have cracking done so that way there is no excess heavy oil, but there's essentially just oil produced to allow balancing between light and petroleum oil. And these are all put into tanks, and wires help to measure the fluid at any given time. So if you hover over one of the electrical poles, you'll see that there is an equal amount of light oil and petroleum. And as far as the assemblers and chemical plants themselves, about 2/3 of the chemical plants use the light oil to produce the solid fuel, while about 1/3 of the chemical plants use petroleum to make the solid fuel. And those then get divvied up into these cars that conveniently fit perfectly between the 12 beacons here, and that way I can do as direct insertion as possible between the solid fuel to the rocket fuel assemblers. For some reason, if I do have an excess of petroleum versus the light oil, this pump knows to open to allow the excess petroleum to feed on through these pipes here, and instead go on to the plastic plant over here. Just to the left of the rocket fuel is a central location for coal drop-off and pick-up, but the reason why I like this is because that way the trains that need the coal for science don't have to travel as far to my mining outpost to pick up the coal. They can just come here, which is a lot more efficient. I also conveniently planned on having the plastic factory just below the coal drop-off point because, of course, plastic uses a ton of coal. And the plastic then divvies up the plastic to one of 2 ways. It either goes from right to left, feeding into the cars that then use the plastic to supply the red circuit factory, or the plastic also feeds upwards, which feeds trains that deliver plastic to other points around the base. And then to the very far left, past another train unloading area, is crude oil drop-off that feeds into these refineries here. These again only do basic oil processing, so this way 100% of the petroleum products end up feeding into the plastic factory just over here to the right via all of these pipes and pumps. I've also added in these lights here to any fluid drop-off point around the base, and when they're green it gives me a good visual cue that I definitely have enough crude oil coming in, but for whatever reason if they turn red, then I know that there's something I need to fix to improve the fluid throughput. The smelting factories are all fairly similar. Each electric furnace is fully beaconed with the ore being delivered via belt along long columns of smelters, but I do use bots to pick up the ore from the active provider boxes when the train drops them off, as you can see here, and then those bots put the ore into these requester boxes, which then feed the ore down either the lines up or bottom. So half of the trains in these sections here are for delivery of the ore, the other half of the trains are for pickup of the smelted item. I also have multiple stackers on either side of the smelters, so one stacker is for the ore trains coming in, and I also have a designated area for a personal train, and then the other half of the stacker is for the pickup trains, or the trains coming in to pick up this smelted material. And those also include a fuel drop-off point, which is where a universal fuel train comes here when the fuel drops below a certain amount. Otherwise, the train station is turned off as long as there's enough fuel in this section, and that helps to lower the congestion of unnecessary trains traveling to locations where they don't need to go. You'll also notice that in the case of my iron and copper smelting factories, I do have a lot of circuitry and combinators and wires involved to the signals as well as the train stations themselves. And those are all ultimately wired into this train overflow parking lot that I have built in here. This one over here is for the iron overflow trains, this one here for the copper. But this way I've got the stations hooked up into signals and wires to allow these train stations to turn on, just in case these stackers adjacent to the smelters become full, which does happen when the base is turned off. The only difference between the steel smelters versus the iron and copper smelters is that I do have the iron ore getting smelted on site at the steel smelting area as well. So instead of bussing in iron plate that's already been smelted, I have iron ore trains continue to drop off the iron ore just like I do over at the iron smelter. And the iron ore gets fed into columns of smelters that feed the iron ore into iron plate. And then about the other half of the smelters from about here on upwards smelt that iron plate into steel. Stone brick smelting is done just below steel, but I also have a stone swapping area just here, and that way the trains that are delivering either stone brick or stone ore to the science factories can just come to one central location instead of having to venture out onto the outer train network, so it's a lot more efficiently done here. Speaking of train tracks, my train network is obviously very large and complicated, much more so than I think any other train network I've ever seen, and perhaps most definitely overkill, but having a very clean and jam-free train network was something that was really important to me, especially after I had so many congestion issues in my previous 0.16 series. There are 174 active trains on this map, so to keep congestion low, I created separate inner and outer train networks. So where I'm standing now is considered the inner train network, and the stuff out here is considered the outer train network. So the purpose of the outer train network is to carry trains that primarily have ore of some kind, whether it be coal, iron, copper, stone, etc. Also, I have a section of train tracks for an artillery train as well as my personal train. Meanwhile, the inner train tracks carry products or pick up products consisting of smelted materials. So these will only be products that are refined, and they only stay on the inner train network, with the goal being the inner and outer train networks never should cross. I also obviously have multiple train tracks here, so instead of having just like one pair of tracks with one track going one way and the other track coming the other way, I have a pair of tracks for similar train types. So to keep track of everything, we'll go over from one pair of tracks to the other. So this pair of tracks is just for the purpose of carrying my personal train or for fuel trains. This pair of tracks is for copper plate. This pair of tracks is for plastic, and this pair of tracks is for iron plate. Now, the portions of train tracks kind of changes depending on where you are in the base. So the further out you go along here, the materials on the tracks might change a little bit, and certainly they're changing over here by the time we're getting to dropping off rocket parts to the lower portion of the right circle. But the point being, I was trying to differentiate the tracks so that there will be as much similar trains on one section of tracks as possible, with very little overlap of dissimilar trains on that similar section of track. And as you can see from map view, this is working very smoothly. I have very little density of my trains at any given time, and this has really helped keep my congestion very low and to keep all of my trains very well organized. This map is on vanilla settings, and biter expansion is still turned on, meaning I still get frequent biter attacks. So to protect my mining outposts, I have an additional train stop to the left and right of the bottommost circle, so that's here and here. And we can't see the train now, but there actually is a train in motion going and repairing things, which has a wagon like this that is filled with a bunch of mining outposts and defensive materials like bots, turrets, walls, rails, and that type of thing. But also on the train that is not currently at the station, it also has an artillery wagon that is at the very end. That is arriving just now, which gets filled up with artillery shells when needed. And then that train only goes to the outpost when it gets an alert that there is a signal from the construction bots that their availability drops below a certain amount. And that typically only happens when the mining outposts are getting attacked. So that way the trains can know to go to the mining outposts via this setup here when anything is getting damaged or when any of the materials needed to repair or replenish the materials of the mining outposts get below a certain level. I do owe JD Plays credit for the defensive wagon design. As you can see, it's already working and it just comes to the station when it's needed. And it does help to fire the artillery shells, albeit pretty slowly, but enough so that it has cleared out a lot of my perimeter nests that have been problematic. Unfortunately, because my mining outposts are now so well defended, and with the addition of the one artillery wagon that periodically goes out, it's kind of put my Big Bertha-like artillery wagon setup kind of out of commission, but I suppose it still could come in handy if you were needing to expand much further out. Now that I have such a high mining productivity, I do use a combination of bots and belts for delivery. So how this works is that I do have a very traditional mining setup where the ore spits out onto the belts nearby, but then those belts take the ore to a very centralized location as close to the roboports as possible. So that way the bots have very little room for them to travel between the pickup of the ore to the requester boxes for the ore into the trains. And here's a closer look at my perimeter wall, which has a combination of artillery, laser, and flamethrower turrets that are just out of range of the outer train tracks to prevent the tracks from catching fire. And that is a lesson that I learned the hard way. So there have been a couple instances where I've had to either move the wall or the train tracks over by just a touch. But the point being, it now works just fine. It's perfectly able to be defended, and it does work well for killing the biters. I also made sure that the logistic coverage within the wall section is also separate from the main base logistic network, so everything within the perimeter walls is separate. So in order to continue to have a resupply of the materials, one of the trains over here actually does bring a supply of materials to this train station over here so that the bots can use those materials and have plenty of repair packs for repairing when needed. As far as energy goes, this base uses about 9.2 gigawatts or so when fully up and running with science going on. So right now, whereas science has stopped, we're nowhere close to that mark. We're only using about 7.6 gigawatts right now. But I do have the majority of my power being produced via nuclear power plants like you can see here. And I've got a ton of different versions of nuclear power plants. They were kind of designed just to see where I could fit them in the spaces I had available. So we've got this version here and here. We've also got all of these kind of L-shaped ones. We've got a couple butterfly-shaped ones up here to the main circle. We've got a larger square-shaped one over here. But when I did design these, I tried to keep in mind using the Factorio calculator to keep the calculations and the ratios as close to perfect as possible, which I was pretty well able to pull off. I also made sure to use a lot of circuitry with my nuclear power plants, so every single one of them has the same setup here, which has these inserters wired up to a combinator here, which measures the steam that is available in the tanks nearby, and that way I can also guarantee that I have low waste for my nuclear fuel cells. We are now in the mini base where I have my uranium ore smelting over here and then my Covarex and basically anything to do with U-235 or 238 or fuel cells occurring over here. So this works very smoothly, but there are a lot of combinators and circuitry involved to help prevent uranium-235 and 238 jamming. And this is a traditional setup that I've used essentially since my 0.16 series that works very well. But the fuel cells are produced here. They end up going onto this train and wagon setup here. And that wagon ends up going back to this main train drop-off point that is just below the bottommost circle. The fuel or nuclear fuel cells end up going onto the cars, and then from there the cars go back into a circular rotation on the bottommost circle. And from here we have an inserter pull off the fuel or the nuclear fuel into an adjacent box, which is then available for the main logistic network. The bots then deliver any of that fuel throughout the base where it needs to go. I also have a couple speakers wired up in the main base as well as over here to the actual building process itself for the fuel cells and the nuclear fuel, and that way if there is for some reason any drop in my supply, I can come over and manually fix it before it gets too out of hand. And then this is a more detailed look at my mini base, but like I said earlier, these factories are essentially scaled down or smaller versions of my bigger factories, so we won't go into too much detail about this. And if you remember, the whole purpose of this mini base is to keep my lower circle, which is essentially the supply depot, and my modules up and running without having to steal any resources from my larger factories that go solely into science. And lastly, we are at original spawn point where the first few episodes of the series took place, but now spawn is differentiated by these 4 lights that you can see here, which, as you can tell, is a very dangerous place to spawn. But as you saw with this train stopping, I've included a lot of circuitry and some smarts and some signaling here to make it safe for new spawns or people that have died to end up spawning here instead of just dying to a rogue train coming through the middle of your spawn point. And how this works is that basically these signals read if a player is in this spawn point here, and the signal turns red, which does not allow the train to pass through. So that way the safety of the player is prioritized instead of the throughput of the train. After you die and respawn, or you're spawning in for the first time, you can rest assured that you'll be able to get to the spawn train safely. All you have to do is hop in and it will automatically take you back to the main base area, or you can have it control click anywhere throughout the train tracks to take you to where you last died. And that leads us right back to base, where we will wrap up this tour. This base was designed to be as aesthetically pleasing, creative, and to produce 1000 signs per minute while on vanilla settings with as few mods as possible, so I would say that my objective is accomplished. The only mods used were a zoom mod to allow me better vision when placing large factories, and waterfill mod, which did supply the water instead of busing it to the factories via train or long distance pipes. This base has overall taken me over 500 hours plus many more hours in separate creative maps for designing and testing purposes. But now, a year on this map, I am looking forward to definitely taking a break, trying some different Factorio gameplay content such as an achievement run, and still peppering in different game content on this channel as well. If you liked this video or my content, you can show your support by subscribing or checking out my other base tours, which are linked at the end. BP strings and a base download will also be available in the next few days. But for now, this is Poober signing off for this base tour and for this series, but I hope you guys will continue to stick around, and I will be seeing you all soon. Sub to me, and you'll be in a